Hey guys, in this video we're going to make a knotted wrap to hold a heart-shaped crystal. This design is the same on both sides and makes a really cute pendant or hanger. For our design today we're using a crystal heart that's 40 by 40 millimeters. The cording we're using is 0.8 millimeter polyester thread, and we need one 15-inch length and one 40-inch length. So just measure and cut both of those lengths. Starting our wrap, we place the ends of the long cord together, following it back down to the middle. Now placing the ends together on the short cord, following that back down to the middle as well. Now we place both the middles together, and we're going to tie a simple overhand knot onto that spot. So bringing the cords around to form a loop, bringing the ends through the loop and pulling that down tight. Pulling on both cords to make sure it's nice and tight. Now, depending on the size of your crystal, that sort of dictates how far apart these knots need to be. So for my size crystal here, the 40 millimeter, we tie these two knots here and the loop in between holds the crystal secure at the bottom. So for my size crystal, we want the second knot to be about 1 1/4 inches away from that first knot. So holding on to that point, bring the cord around to form a loop, tails through the loop, and now we're going to pull it down nice and tight onto that exact spot. So just over 1 inch apart in between the knots. Make sure those knots are nice and tight, and now you can sort of test it on your crystal. So this little loop in between the two knots, you should be able to put the base of your heart inside. Now you don't want any holes that are big enough that your crystal can fall out. Now holding both knots nice and evenly, one on the front, one on the back, and then bringing one front cord and one back cord across to the side of your heart and holding that point there. This is where we're going to tie our next knot. So holding your cords nice and evenly and then bringing the cords around to form a loop, bringing the ends through the loop and pulling it down onto that spot. It ends up being about 3/4 of an inch. So just under 1 inch away from those first knots. Pulling both cords nice and tight. Now we're going to tie another even knot on the other side with the last two cords. So bringing the cords around to form a loop, bringing the ends through the loop and pulling it down nice and evenly and about 3/4 of an inch away from those first knots. Making sure everything's nice and tight, and now we can try it on the heart again. So you do want it to be quite tight on your heart. You want it to hold it really nice and secure. And like I said before, you don't want any holes big enough that your little crystal can fall out. Making sure those knots sit right on the side edges of your crystal, that it's nice and snug to hold that crystal secure. You can always untie and retie any of these knots before you keep going, but at this point mine is looking how I want it to. So holding the wrap onto the crystal nice and firmly with the knots on each edge and bringing one cord across the front from each side. Now it will be about the same distance apart, again tying another overhand knot. Bringing that cord around to form a loop, bringing the ends through the loop and pulling that knot tight about another 3/4 of an inch away from the previous knots. Pulling the knots nice and tight and now tying another overhand knot on these last two cords. Making sure they're nice and even, bringing them around to form a loop, bringing the ends through the loop and pulling it down tight onto that same spot. About 3/4 of an inch away from the previous knot. It may seem a little bit hard to follow, but if you get lost, just place your wrap back onto your crystal and you'll see which cords need to come together. Now at this point we're just going to check it on our crystal again. Remember, making sure it's nice and tight and snug on that crystal. Sometimes you have to kind of push it into the wrap to get it in the right position, but it's much better to be a little bit tight than loose. So just working with your twine until you can get it in the right position. You can see here I'm pulling it up quite firmly at the top and just working the twine all over until it sits in the right positions and is nice and even on the front and the back. Once you're happy with the actual wrap on your crystal, we're going to go ahead and just secure it at the top. So I bring in one thread from each side and tie them in a simple knot. So left over right and then right over left, pulling that down nice and tight. Then I bring the remaining 2 cords up to the middle and wrap them around as well, tying them in a knot around the base. Making sure everything's really nice and tight. It's a little bit hard to see, but if you hold that knot up tight, then you can wrap these remaining 2 cords around the outside of the knot. Once they're secured around the bottom there, I cut the tails off and singe them all with a lighter so they don't fray. Once you're happy with the knots, then you can cut these 2 shorter cords off. And this is where you can gently melt them and fuse them onto the knot, making sure it's not too bulky. Now with these 2 longer cords, you can tie another overhand knot at the end for your pendant or hanger. And there's your knotted crystal heart wrap.